Good evening, and welcome to Reckoning the Legacy of Race and Racism in Georgetown. I'm Mark Hudson, Executive Director of Tudor Place Historic House and Garden. We're pleased to be a partner in organizing this event with our colleagues from other organizations in Georgetown at Dumbarton House, Mount Zion Female Union Band Historic Memorial Park, and Georgetown Heritage. Earlier this summer, in the days following the death of George Floyd, the directors of these organizations met to discuss how we could be agents of positive change in our neighborhood. We recognize that historical organizations have an important mandate to serve as conveners and facilitate discussions around topics that affect the lives of the people we serve. This is the first in what we hope to be a series of community conversations that will explore the history of race and race relations in our community to help us understand the present and allow us to consider a better future. And given the tremendous response to this event, there are over 200 people joining us this evening. It appears that others agree this is important. For this discussion, we've invited a panel of thought leaders, scholars, and descendants to share their perspectives on the topic. We'll begin with a discussion with the panelists moderated by Neville Waters, followed by an opportunity for questions from all of you in the audience that will be fielded by Karen Daly from Dumbarton House. After that, Jeff Nichols from Georgetown Heritage will offer some concluding remarks. And if you'd like to pose a question to the panelists, please use the question function that you see on your control functions below. If you have comments that you would like to make or information that you would like to share, please use the comment function. But if you want to make sure that you get a question to the panelists, please use the question function. So I'm pleased to start our program by introducing Neville Waters, who will introduce our panel. Neville currently serves as Public Affairs Specialist with the Department of For-Hire Vehicles. Previous work experience spanned the sports, hospitality, and media industries, with his professional career beginning in the music and radio industry. He graduated magna cum laude from Springfield College in Massachusetts and received a master's degree in psychological services from there. He later earned his MBA from Georgetown University, and perhaps most importantly for our conversation this evening, Neville is a fifth-generation Georgetowner. So Neville, thank you for leading our discussion this evening, and thank you to all of you for joining us.
Thank you very much. That's a wonderful introduction. I was listening to you and I was like, wow, who's that guy? I really appreciate this opportunity to moderate this discussion. There's some people that I'm going to introduce you to shortly that I have a tremendous amount of respect for, and I look forward to having frankly, a raw, organic conversation here. And I would say that it would be, I think we would be missing the mark if there's not some pain, some anger, some insight, some inspiration. I think part of reckoning is dealing with the history in a very honest and open manner. I can just say, for myself, as you said, a fifth-generation Georgetowner, a Black man in America, that I also was certainly misinformed. I grew up, I thought that Georgetown was all Black. Now, there was certainly a significant amount of people here, but it wasn't all Black. Just the same, I never heard about any of my family members who were enslaved. And yet, a recent program that was conducted at the cemetery, it piqued my interest into discovering my ancestry, and I come to find out that I had two great uncles, great uncles that I've seen. They're identical twins, and I recently discovered documentation that their freedom was bought when they were 6 years old, and they were Georgetown residents. And frankly, that was in many ways very empowering for me to connect with my history there. Anyway, in addition to being a longtime resident, I also serve as the president of the Female Union Band Society. I guess I should say the Mount Zion Church Female Union Band Society historic Memorial Park. It's the cemetery. Our sacred space is located at 27th and Q Street. It's right next door to Dumbarton House. It's a wonderful area that we encourage people to visit. You can find us on the website at blackgeorgetown.com. We're also on Facebook and Instagram, also under those names of Black Georgetown. That sacred space is a place that we have been making a lot of effort in restoring some of its past and legacy. The fact that there was a time where Black people and white people couldn't even be buried together, it saddens me that was an accepted practice. And part of this sacred space now enables people to have some moment of meditation and reflection. Very peaceful area. So finished with all my plugs. Let me begin by introducing our panelists here. We're going to spend just under an hour. We have some specific questions we're going to speak to them about and hopefully get some dialogue going. I'm going to give each of them an opportunity to introduce themselves, maybe tell a little bit about themselves. So I'm going to start in no particular order, although alphabetically she would come first. Dr. Valerie Babb, who is currently the Andrew Mellon Professor at Emory University. But for me, she is one of the authors of this book, Black Georgetown Remembered. So Valerie Babb.
Thank you very much, Neville. It is so nice seeing you again and seeing Dr. Roach again, who I remember as a little bitty thing when we actually started this whole project, which was probably one of the best projects I have ever done in my life. I am at Emory University, but I became interested in this project because the whole idea of removing communities is something that hits home to me. I grew up in Harlem, New York, and I have seen that happen in several waves over time. So this project spoke to me in very specific ways. I also appreciated getting to know the history and the legacies of a community that I worked in when I was a former professor at Georgetown University without even knowing all of its specificities. I would walk by places that I later came to know the significance and meanings of, and that has stayed with me and haunted me.
All right, thank you. Our next panelist that I want to introduce, tremendous respect for, Mrs. Ann Chin. I would refer to her as the founder of the Middle Passage ceremonies. Is that correct? But right. Moreover than that, she's a sixth generation Georgetown descendant who brings a great deal of insight. And I have a tremendous amount of respect for her knowledge. Ann Chin.
Thank you, Neville. Can you everyone hear me? Okay. I'm living in Jacksonville, Florida, but I was born and raised in Washington, D.C. And this evening I will share a little bit of my family history during this panel. Dr. Valerie Babb, I first got your book as a gift from my aunt, Hannah Williams, who worked in the project. The Waters, the Rochers, the Jacksons, there were so many families that we grew up hearing the names of. My family was part of Black Georgetown for 136 years, from 1805 until 1941. Georgetown was home base. It was the reference that the family used to explain things, to tell stories, and also to keep secrets. I will probably say some things tonight that have never been shared before publicly. I have sort of mixed feelings about it, but I think it's time that we put things out and address them. I think that's the only way we can move forward. And as you said, Neville, I am executive director of the Middle Passage Ceremonies and Port Markets Project because for many families, it is assisting in identifying where our families first arrived. And for my family in Washington, D.C., it is Georgetown. So I look forward to being part of this program. Thank you.
Great. Our next panelist, I just frankly found out that he is as distinguished as he is. People could tell me his name is Derek, then I see his name is George, and now I see he's a doctor. But Dr. George Musgrove, he's the associate professor at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. Moreover, he's also the co-author of a book, Chocolate City, A History of Race and Democracy in the Nation's Capital, that I understand is the definitive narrative of understanding Black people in DC. So, Dr. Musgrove.
Thank you, Neville. Well, I'm very happy to be here, and I'll just pile on and say that Black Georgetown Remembered is also one of my faves on my bookshelf, and so thanks, Dr. Babb.
The next panelist here, frankly, full disclosure, is my neighbor. I have proud to say I've actually watched her grow up. Very proud of her accomplishments. She's now a member of the DC Democratic State Committee, a delegate, I think it is. She's also a public school administrator. Moreover, she is a longtime Georgetown resident with deep roots and deep concerns about our community, Dr. Monica Roche.
Good evening, everyone. It is truly an honor to be a part of this panel. It's very meaningful to continue to tell the story of my family and the often forgotten history of African Americans here in Georgetown. To this day, people are shocked when I say where I live. Oh, you must have a lot of money. You know, they just don't understand the roots, the struggles of the African American families to come here, to establish themselves, to make sure they were educated, and to hold on to their property as long as they could. So I'm just so happy that my family was a part of the book, you know, Black Georgetown Remembered, again. And when I've lost so many family members, and, you know, when I want to learn more, I always just go back to this history and you know, my family tree and just all about my family and, you know, which I'll talk about tonight. But it's so important as we see what's happening in DC and throughout the city. I always say Georgetown was probably the first gentrified part of DC, or one of the first. And just what's happening and how this is no longer Chocolate City, you know, when you think about your book, Chocolate City. So I'm here to definitely share. I'm a proud Georgetowner. I was born in Georgetown. I still live in Georgetown, 5th generation Georgetown, and I hope, you know, when I die, it's going to be here in Georgetown. So glad to be here this evening.
Thank you. And our last panelist, before we get started with some discussion here, Dr. Adam Rothman. He's a professor of history at Georgetown. He's also the principal curator of the Georgetown Slavery Archive project, and he also has good taste in artwork.
Thanks, Neville. It's wonderful to be here. I'm really actually humbled to be on a panel with so much knowledge about Georgetown and Georgetown's history. I'm really a newcomer to this story. I was a member of Georgetown University's working group on slavery, memory, and reconciliation, which really tried to unearth the university's historical connections to slavery. And since then, over the last 5 years, I've been the curator of a website called the Georgetown Slavery Archive, which is trying to make archival materials accessible to the public about that history. I've learned a lot about the university in the last 5 years, and I think its connections to the community outside its walls. And I think it's important to make those connections. Also, as a Georgetown professor, I just want to take 1 minute to just pay my respects to Coach John Thompson, who just passed away a giant figure in the history of our school, history of our community and our city. And I just, he will be remembered.
Yes.
Oh, thank you, Adam. Anyway, let's get the show on the road here. I think part of the reckoning involves, not being dismissive. We're not assigning blame. It's an opportunity to listen, to learn, and then hopefully lead others with this insight and knowledge. So, Valerie, I'm going to start with you. One of the things that frankly interests me, but I think is interesting, how did Black people get here to Georgetown? Who were they? What were some of the stories of Black people and families in early Georgetown?
Well, one word, tobacco. Georgetown was a riverside city. It was actually a Native American village at the time in the 1600s and 1700s. But as Maryland was expanding its tobacco production, it needed people to actually work and harvest that crop. So what we begin to notice is that Africans and African Americans from surrounding plantations were imported into the area, and that became the germ that formed the Georgetown Black population. And it was a variety of people who were actually here. Some certainly were enslaved and came from nearby plantations. Others were free Blacks who were the descendants of immigrants or were the descendants of free slaves in the region. Some worked in what we would consider, I guess, traditional slavery roles, agrarian roles. Others hired themselves out in the growing shipping industry. Because Georgetown was along the Potomac, it was one of the river routes that led to other port areas in the Maryland, Virginia, that whole Chesapeake area. So you have a variety of professions and a variety of legacies, and I think that contributed to making Georgetown the kind of unique community it was.
To follow up on that, Monica, I want to ask you, both free and enslaved Blacks lived and worked and worshiped here. I think it's always interesting because oftentimes we think of slavery being exclusive to the South, and that is not factually correct. And I know you're a descendant, your family has great history here. What do you remember about growing up here, and what do you remember about learning about both free and enslaved Blacks who lived, worked, and worshiped here?
Well, growing up here, at that time, of course, Georgetown was majority white, but there were still quite a bit of families that were here. When I say quite a bit, I mean, I would probably say maybe 20 families were here. Now we're down to 5, Neville, I think, that remaining. And so many of the people that are in the book, Black Georgetown Remembered, were still living. So I got to grow up hearing their stories and hearing the joy they had. When you say you're a Georgetown, you're proud to say you're a Georgetown, even for the families who have, maybe they didn't even live here growing up, but then they still come back to worship, or they'll come back to anniversary ceremonies and celebrations. And so that pride was there that, we were once slaves here. We were once, working in different trades, but we also did well, worked hard, and educated ourselves. So we had doctors, we had, teachers, lawyers, businessmen. The Stokowskis right across from me on 28th and Q was a business. There were, African Americans owned cleaners, and they had medical practices. And so we were a thriving community in Georgetown. And what my family was determined for me to know is that we weren't just slaves. We didn't just work at the harbor or the port. And we were proud for what we were able to do after that. So I was always very envious growing up to hear these wonderful stories of this African American community, which besides me and my cousin, that was it in terms of African American kids growing up. So you hear of the stories of the Rose Park playground and the boys club and the sports leagues. I was very, very fortunate to tennis lessons by Margaret and Romania Peters, the infamous Peters sisters, the legendary Peters sisters, who won. Romania actually beat Althea Gibson. So they would have been Venus and Serena if times had been very different. So I didn't even know I was getting tennis lessons from a legend at that time. So just the experiences and to be able to go to all the churches. I'm Catholic. My great-great-grandfather, Moses Booth, was one of the African-American families that got tired of the treatment at Trinity Catholic Church here in Georgetown. So they fought to build Epiphany Catholic Church, where I'm still a member. Neville's family was a part of that. Neville's still a member when he goes. And, you know, and, I gotta call you out, Neville. And so to know that my family played such a significant role in the establishment of that church. Unfortunately, as African Americans moved out of Georgetown, they don't come back every week. You know, it's hard to find parking over here, and all the churches are struggling. Well, African American churches are struggling. So, you know, I wish, I tell my cousins all the time, I wish we had been able to be here. And, you know, I'll talk later about how we were stripped of that joy and how African Americans were wiped out of Georgetown and what laws and regulations were put in place when we get to that part. But definitely, my family made sure I understood. And one thing that also that would happen, and I really wish it would start again, was the Black family Georgetown reunion, or the Black Georgetown reunion that used to happen every year. And our families were Hannah Nash, Williams Nash, Neville's family were a part of, the Dotsons, and we're all a part of bringing that together. And I really wish we would bring that together, you know, bring the families back, do it here in Georgetown, and to share those stories. So that's
yeah, you know, it's, I remember hearing the stories of Joe Louis fighting, and at that time everybody would be listening on the radio, and when he won, everyone would run out of their houses and scream and yell in the street. You know, our block obviously probably had as many Black people living on it back when our parents were growing up, and so indeed that is something that we, you know, we don't have now. You know, Adam, I'm gonna come to you because I want to go even deeper, if you will, given, you know, some of the work that you've done. Tell us, you know, how was, I guess, for lack of a better description, urban slavery considered different than sort of the traditional way that, or perceptions that we have of how slavery was? I mean, the plantation and the antebellum South, but urban slavery, if you will, was a little different. But like I said, give us a little deep background.
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Neville. And I would say that, you know, we've already gotten a flavor of that from the comments that have already been made. Dr. Babb pointed out that tobacco was at the heart of the Chesapeake slave economy. But here in Georgetown, in the district, the enslaved people who lived and worked here weren't growing tobacco. The picture that a lot of people have in their minds of the big cotton and sugar plantations, it just doesn't apply to the way people lived in towns and cities like Georgetown. To sum it up in a word, I think, you know, the nature of slavery in a place like Georgetown was commercial rather than agricultural. And that shapes everything. It shapes the labor that enslaved people did, as Dr. Babb was saying. People, they didn't grow things, but they moved things around. They worked in household work. They did construction. They were teamsters. They worked on the canal. Anything that had to be done to make this commercial economy run in Georgetown, they did. It's striking to hear, you know, how few Black families remain in Georgetown today in the late 20th century, because the Black population of Georgetown in the 19th century was a quarter to a third of the entire community. I mean, they were really here in big numbers, and they did the work that made Georgetown run. But there's more to it than that. Cities are known for their hustle and bustle and their sociability. And it gave a different quality of life and living to even to enslaved people. So they're out in the streets, they're out in the markets, they're able to talk with each other in public spaces and in churches and even in schools. So there's a kind of urban sociability that knit the slave and free Black community together here in Georgetown. That would not have been the case necessarily in the countryside. And that also meant that there were these glimpses of freedom for the enslaved community in Georgetown. They could see their free Black brothers and sisters walking around. They had opportunities to actually get free. We've already heard that, I think, Neville, from your story about your family. People ran away. They actually sued for their freedom. And one of the most remarkable things is enslaved people earning enough money to actually buy their freedom, which happened quite a bit. And it's one of the ways the free Black community arose. But I don't want to paint too rosy of a picture of enslaved life in a place like Georgetown, because there's a darker side to it as well, because it was still slavery. And one of the things you find in towns and cities is a more public apparatus of punishment and control. You have the jails and the auction blocks and the police and the patrols who are keeping people in line. I saw one of the most remarkable things I've seen in the annals of slavery. I was looking at the Georgetown Slave Code recently, and there's a line in there that prohibits slaves from flying kites. It just struck me. I mean, as an extraordinary thing. I mean, the kind of level of malevolence that you would have to have embedded in your law to keep people from flying kites. Just that kind of fun, recreational kind of thing. So that was here in Georgetown as well, and it shaped the existence and life of enslaved people. So it's a different thing.
No, that's very powerful testimony and insightful. Along those lines, I'm gonna go right to Anne here, who can share some of her personal story, her personal family story and history. And I'll just, and you can talk as long as you want, because I know you got a lot to say.
But don't tell me that. Don't tell me that. I'll go forever.
So really, her family is very integral in the history of Georgetown.
Yeah, I want to, first of all, in the context of my family, and we're talking about race and racism, for 193 years, generations of my family were held in bondage based on race. So we're talking in documents, court, property records from 1657 to 1850. The family ends up in Georgetown. It's the migration of the Twine family from agricultural setting, Mount Vernon, to urban Washington City, and then in 1805, the Peter family moves to Tudor Place. So my great-great-great-grandmother comes to the district as what they call a dower enslaved person. She is part of the Custis dowry, and Martha Washington's granddaughter gets her, but her whole family is separated. She's an 11-year-old. She's coming from a rural setting to an urban setting, which I always have the sense that Georgetown is really a village. I always thought growing up that Georgetown was all Black. I mean, to hear my family tell the story, you know, I just thought white folks came later on. So the Peter family first lived, I think, in Washington City on K Street, and they're building this place on the hill, which becomes Tudor Place. And that's where 13-year-old now, Barbary, ends up. Her family, however, are on the Peter farms, because that's the other thing. When Adam talks about the transition from agricultural to urban, a lot of these urban families had farms on the outlying area. Tenleytown, the Peter family had a farm in Seneca, you know, so Barbary has potentially relatives, her siblings and her mother maybe, who are not accessible to her daily, but they're on these outlying plantations and farms. So one of the funny stories is that she loved Georgetown. I mean, she loved being in the street, being with a whole bunch of folks and not doing farm work. You know, she was a nursemaid. So that occasionally I really think that she would get in trouble so that her punishment would be to be sent to the farm. Not because she liked the farm work, but possibly that was a chance for her to see members of her family. I mean, so we're talking already about how Black people navigate a system. And you don't tell everything. You don't say, oh, well, it's time for me to go see my mom or my sisters and brother, you know, so I'm going to act up. I'm going to stay out beyond the time, or I'm going to associate with people who the Peter family doesn't like me to deal with. So, you know, she worked that, and that worked, I think, to her advantage, so we at least could keep some track of the family, the Twine family. Barbary is separated not only from her mother and her siblings, but her father, because he was the property of George Washington, was freed. So the family is split completely. The father is in Virginia. She never sees him that I know ever again after 1801, when Martha Washington just disperses everybody because she's scared to death. But Georgetown and life at Tudor Place, I think, gave Barbary an opportunity to be part of a very vibrant Black community. At Tudor Place, she and her daughter and her granddaughter were nursemaids. Her granddaughter, born in 1829, is Hannah, who is a surviving twin and a child of one of the Peter sons. The Peter family owning Tudor Place. In her late teens, she sold to a Georgetown neighbor, former South Carolina Congressman John Carter, so that his enslaved nephew, Alfred, could marry and live with her. And by 1847, Alfred, who is my great-grandfather, Alfred's mother, Jedida, who is a Moroccan, Alfred and Hannah, who is pregnant with their first child, are all part of the Carter household. And I really think that because Hannah was pregnant with their first child, my great-grandfather, in, I guess, taking advantage of his connections, becomes part of the Pearl escape. He's one of the few who, and I don't know whether people know that story, it was thwarted because everybody was captured at Point Lookout and returned. Most of the people were in fact sold downriver. The Edmondson Sisters, who are the famous family in terms of abolition, are part of the campaign for the end of slavery for the United States. They're purchased. But Alfred comes back. His uncle goes over to Alexandria, picks him up from the famous slave market pen there in Alexandria, brings him home. And the uncle says, you know, why did you do this? I mean, you have freedom to move around. You can read, you can write, you have your own, you know, business in terms of working at his coal. Why? And his answer was, I'm enslaved. You know, I don't have that freedom, and my family doesn't either. And with that, Carter put into his will that his entire household would be freed manumitted upon his death, and he died 3 years later. And also, sort of unusual is that Carter gives a stipend to each one of the members of his manumitted household. So with this, the family moves to Poplar, well, it was Poplar Alley then. It turns into Poplar Court when Georgetown becomes gentrified. So the family moves into an alley house. And my grandfather works at the lumber yard that the Carters owned, but he also starts his own business, which is collecting night waste throughout Georgetown. And he saves and he buys property. And, you know, he starts having many, many children, but, you know, his theme was that everybody should be free. He was worked with the Underground Railroad, and he was very involved in the Black community. For my family, by 1850, Georgetown was a place of freedom and community. It offered a level of protection. I mean, the reason that I think that my family never left Georgetown was because of their affiliation with the Carters and the Marburys and the Peter. I mean, the Fugitive Slave Act was rampant. Didn't make any difference whether you were free or you had self-emancipated. If you got caught by by one of these people who were capturing people and selling them downriver, you know, you don't have much recourse. So I think that that is principally why the family stayed in Georgetown until after, you know, particularly before the Civil War. This was their protection. And I think that the family defined and created services. They defined themselves as what their institutions would be. They say that history is identity, but I think also survival and the means of navigating systems that still are repressive, made part of what our family was involved with. I would say education and religion were the social focus for Georgetown residents. There certainly were affiliations outside, but it was always, no matter what you did, you came home to Georgetown. That's where you resided. I mean, you may have worked, you know, you may have gone to school outside, you may have gone even to church. I mean, my family went to St. Luke's, which is on 15th Street. It's across the bridge. I mean, and that's sort of how everything was defined. You know, it's either everything was across the bridge. And I can remember, you know, people coming to the Georgetown reunion saying, "Oh, we're part of Georgetown." And the first question was, "Well, where did you live? Where did your family live?" You know, and if somebody gave anything outside of the borders across the bridge, it was like, "Oh, no. You're not part of Georgetown, you know. But we'll let you stay. I mean, you can stay and celebrate with us, but don't get confused. I mean, you're not a Georgetown."
Yeah. Well, yeah. And let me get a take here from I keep wanting to call you Derek from Dr. Musgrove over here, because you said something that I think connects to what I ask him about. And it's always interesting to me when I hear stories about enslaved people being given their freedom upon someone's death, which I guess on some level is it's supposed to be a grand act. It actually sort of what angers me, because the idea is like, well, but I'm going to keep you enslaved as long as I'm alive, and then I'm going to be this benevolent person and say, well, I'm dead. Well, yeah, you're dead. Like, I'm supposed to now continue to be, enslaved to you now that you're dead, which goes to another issue. We're talking about, sort of the quote slave catcher. So Dr. Musgrove, talk to us in some context more broadly about how laws and policies around slavery and even now today have an impact on Blacks in Washington.
Sure, and thank you for the question. I'll try to start right at the end of the Civil War because I think that's a good jumping off point. And if you look at Georgetown in relationship to the rest of the city, and you look specifically at the Black population in Georgetown in relation to the rest of the city, one of the things it has going for it is that it's a long resident population and has been able to gather up a good amount of resources as a result. And so, white Georgetowners are very hostile to Black rights. If you look at the referendum that was held in Georgetown in 1865, which was an effort on the part of the city leadership to show Congress, which of course is about to vote on the Negro Suffrage Act of 1866, which would give the vote to African-American men in DC. They want to tell Congress, look, based on the vote that we're taking here, we don't want this. And the vote is overwhelming. There's 713 people that vote in the referendum, and only one of them votes in favor of the Negro Suffrage Act, right? So white popular opinion about where Black folks fit in the social hierarchy in Georgetown is very well established. It's a very thoroughly Southern port city in 1865. But then, of course, they don't have control over this legislation because it's Congress considering it for the entire district. And so the legislation passes, and Georgetown is the first municipality within the district, because we have to remember that at this point, Georgetown and Washington City still have separate city governments, right? So Georgetown had its mayoral election a couple months before Washington City in 1867. And Black voters come out in astonishingly high numbers. I mean, when Black folks get the vote for the first time in 1867, 68 across the South, their turnout rates are well above 80, 90% in most places. They see voting as sort of a communal activity it's about sort of protecting the small amount of rights that they can get and then using them to advance to full citizenship rights. And what they do is they are able to push out the long-serving, this is his second time around as mayor, the long-serving mayor of Georgetown, a guy named Addison. And it is an inspiration to African-American Republicans across the city who come out in the Washington City election and are able to elect an abolitionist in Washington City, a guy named Sales Bowen, who very quickly, begins the process of radical reconstruction in the city. So Georgetown is really inspiring in that way. And then the year before that election, I forgot to point this out, DC in 1866 has the first Emancipation Day parade in the city, and it would become a city event for the next 40 years. It ends in 1901 because of bickering between the folks who were organizing it. But some of the main sponsors of the Emancipation Day parade, which winds through almost the entire city, I mean, they march for miles and miles with about 10,000 people ending up at Franklin Square in the middle of downtown for this torchlight event. It's really an amazing display. But a lot of the money that goes into funding that first Emancipation Day parade comes from Georgetown African-American organizations, because they're some of the longest resident and relatively the most affluent among African Americans in the city. And I want to emphasize the word relatively. We're not talking about rich Black people here. But part of the reason that you have that ability to influence politics so quickly, that ability to fund the Emancipation Day parade in 1866, is because you had this long resident population that has been able to get freedom relatively early in the 1800s. We have to remember that DC becomes a majority free Black population, or has a majority free Black population, right about in the middle 1830s, right? We tip from majority slave to majority free. And Georgetown has a good share of that free Black population. And so those African Americans are able to build institutions, schools, churches, and amass property. And that allows them to they have the resources to make something of their freedom in the 1860s and beyond.
I'm sorry. I would say the laws and policies, obviously there are some who would argue are still in place today, impacting how the system treats Black people. And I know, Monica, you were mentioning in your earlier remarks about the gentrification and almost the planned dislocation of Black people in Georgetown.
Right. So the first act was the Alleys Dwelling Act in 1934, I believe it was, 1934. So, often African American families lived in, what would be called an alley or, well, they were alleys, around it. And so Popular Street now was Popular Alley, which is a block from here, is where African Americans live. So with this act, it forced these families in the alleys to fix up and renovate their homes. Well, they didn't have the funds because they knew that once homes were getting renovated and you were pushing out African Americans, that is when the white residents would buy these properties and renovate, and the rates would skyrocket. The other act, which is still in place, is the old Georgetown Board Act. That was in the 50s. That I used to be an ANC commissioner in Georgetown, and I see how that act, or that law, is still getting manipulated, or who can do what and what renovations. And it is to protect the historic preservation, but that historic preservation is what got rid of the Black community. Because again, we could not, number one, if we did own, we couldn't keep up with the demands of the renovations of, the houses were required to be single family homes. And so often African Americans had boarding houses because it made it cheaper for housing for African Americans. So then when laws were established where you had to be single family homes, you lost your income, which helped pay for your housing, pay for your payments on your home. And then the rents would go up. And so then African Americans were forced out that way. I look at that as an issue to this day. You have families, including myself, who are in our family homes around the city in my age group, who often can't even stay in the homes because we're getting real estate taxes on our homes as if we bought last night. And that is just another way, here it is in 2020, to get long-term residents out. The few, long-term African American residents that are still holding on in the city. And it's just a major problem. And so from 1930 to now, we're still seeing how wealthy, established people can have control of housing and have control of who is and isn't able to purchase homes.
So I'd throw this out for anyone speaking to what Monica just said. Where did the Black people in Georgetown go? And your family.
Yeah. I'll respond because there are there's several exits in terms of my nuclear family.
Right.
My grandmother decided right before World War I, that she was going to follow a crew that went to the LaDroit Park area. She's going to the new neighborhood, to the new suburbs, and she packs up everybody, and they go first on S Street Northwest and then to 605 Florida Avenue. Well, they stayed Northwest. They stayed there until after World War I, when the 1919 riots broke out. And when she saw the Marines marching down Florida Avenue to quote reinstate order, because of course the Black soldiers are up on the rooftops, shooting. And so of course the government sends in, just like now, the militia.
I was thinking
this is history replayed. She says, I'm out of here. I'm going back to Georgetown where I'm safe and secure. And so by 1917, she and my whole family's back in Georgetown. and there they stayed on Dumbarton Street, right across from Rose Park playground, until 1941, when taxes are too high. Of course, there's the fact that my father, as an in-law, is living in his in-law's house, you know, so you can imagine what kind of dynamics that was. And, you know, they wanted more yard. They wanted a better house. My father could build a house, and that's what they did. So they went to far northeast. Well, by the time I came, which is like 6-7 years later, there's 3 or 4 families in far northeast who are from Georgetown. I mean, that's where people went. They went for more space, bigger, better houses, you know, I guess moving on up. It could be one expression, but also you had to move out, because a lot of times you couldn't afford to stay.
One of the things I found really interesting when I began research for the book was looking at the records of the Georgetown Citizens Association, because I'm an English professor by training, and I was taken by the narrative. Race is rarely mentioned in those documents, but code words such as slum dwellings, lack of sanitation, all of those are intentionally deployed to perpetuate the exodus that you're talking about, and it becomes very painful to see how planned that all was. It was not just ad hoc, really. It was not just developed accidentally by any means.
So, Valerie, is that part of what motivated you in developing the Black Georgetown Remembered book and series, or what was your inspiration?
My inspiration was actually hearing the story of a Black Georgetown community and being a young professor at Georgetown and seeing none of that in the area that I walked through, occupied. So I just became curious. And it coincided with Georgetown University's bicentennial celebration. They were looking for events that could be held, for activities that could be done. So I thought, how can we integrate this rumor that I've heard into this celebration? So that's where the research actually began. And I luckily, really serendipitously met Carol Gibbs, who had been researching this history for a very long time. And he had a brief history that was actually the foundation for the book. And so he knew people, he knew neighborhoods, he knew histories, and was able to tell me, well, this was the minister at this church, this was the minister at that church. And as virtually any Black person who's grown up in a church knows, if you want to get the skinny on anything, you go to the churches. And that's where I met all of you, Dr. Roche's family, Anne, and it just snowballed from there. People had stories, people had photographs, people had documents, and that's what actually gave us the meat for the book.
Dr. Musgrove, you're not from DC, are you?
I'm not. I'm from Baltimore.
That's okay. That's okay. So what sparked your interest in the subject matter?
Well, with Georgetown, it was, you know, that it was the key to understanding gentrification in the city, as far as I could tell. So, you know, there have been 4 different major waves of gentrification that have washed over the city in the 20th century. And Georgetown was the first, but I think more importantly, it was kind of the model for the others. And so you could find, you know, students who were studying gentrification going out into neighborhoods in the 80s. And there's a great study from GW that was done in 1982. And in the interviews that students do in that study, 23% of the people that they talk to who are really talking about gentrification in places like Adams Morgan bring up Georgetown unsolicited, right? And it's because Georgetown loomed that large in people's understanding of gentrification. And so Georgetown, you know, really became the sort of key to understanding the process of what people at the time called private revitalization. The term gentrification doesn't really circulate in DC in any meaningful way before the 70s. And what you have in Georgetown, I think, is really interesting. You know, at the turn of the century, you have a 30% Black population in Georgetown. It's very mixed income. As folks have already said, from doctors and pharmacists to school teachers to hod carriers and janitors, right? But Georgetown is kind of a beat up old neighborhood by the time you get to the early 20th century. I mean, the canal is shut down for good in 1924. You've got light manufacturing that makes it kind of dirty below M Street. You have a shabby aristocracy kind of hanging on to those nice mansions up on top of the hill, but a lot of them still have gas lighting and things like that, right? And so, rich people who are looking for a nice big house aren't going to Georgetown in the early 20th century. They're going to places like Kalorama or going up the Connecticut Avenue corridor. But you have a couple of people from the State Department and the Smithsonian who start moving into the neighborhood in the 20s and in the teens also, who sort of think of it as this like quaint little neighborhood that they can walk to work from. And nobody thinks much of them. Dr. Babb and her co-authors say that there's this sort of rich mosaic in the neighborhood, and they're just one more piece in the mosaic, right? But they begin to have a vision of the neighborhood as kind of class exclusive, that they really begin to push in the 20s. And they are able to turn around the vision that many real estate agents have of Georgetown as not so much a rundown old port city as a quaint old place with beautiful architecture. And right when they're able to get real estate agents to start thinking of Georgetown differently and getting people in the larger city to think of Georgetown differently, you have the New Deal. And all of a sudden you get thousands and thousands of young professionals moving to town. And then you have World War II and the same thing. And so you get this massive housing crunch. And many of these people, seeing Georgetown as a hot new neighborhood, flood in. Real estate agents start kicking out poor renters, Black and Irish, and other poor working people, and fixing up their places. And remember, there's no rent laws. So you just walk in, say get out, and they have to get out. That's the deal, right? Now, there are a goodly number of Black folks who own their homes in Georgetown at this time, and they can't just be kicked out. They're a minority of the population by far, but they still own their homes. Problem is, white banks won't give them credit. The only credit that's being given out is to gentrifiers in Georgetown, right? And that's not possible. Much of the Black middle class that exists in Georgetown depends on poor Black people because they're all service trades focused on Black folks, pharmacists, doctors, school teachers, preachers. So if you look at the one time when Black people had an opportunity to speak out against gentrification before Congress, which is in the hearings over the old Georgetown Act, which Dr. Roche pointed out.
Dr. Marshall, the part of that, Charles Marshall. Yes.
And the two people are literally a teacher and a preacher because their schools and their churches are emptying out of Black people, right? And so even the Black middle class begins to have an incentive to move because the very people that are the foundation of their affluence are in other parts of the city, the segregated Black belt that loops around from Foggy Bottom down into Southwest.
The fact of the matter that we're getting short on time. The term gentrification, whether it is explicit or not, the perception is very much move Black people out, move white people in. It's a painful reminder of some, I guess, more of the insidious elements of systematic racism that hopefully we are dealing with, reckoning with, and as such, hopefully we've got some questions out there. I am going to introduce my professional neighbor. As I said, I serve on the Mount Zion Church Female Union Band Society Foundation Cemetery, and we sit right next to the Dumbarton House. And Karen Daly has been the executive director since I've been involved. She's been extremely supportive of our work. She does some great work over at the Dumbarton House, and I'm going to turn it over to her now to handle some questions and answers with our panelists. I want to thank everybody very much for your time and your insights, and bearing your souls and speaking your truths. Karen, take it away. Thank you.
Neville, thank you so much. Such a nice introduction. Thank you. It's a privilege to be with you all tonight, and I'm learning a tremendous amount. Thank you for sharing your time with us. We have one question that came in from one of our audience members, and Monica, maybe you can lead this one off, and then we can open it up as well. It asks about what you all as panelists see as the future for the Black community in Georgetown, and what, if anything, folks who are interested in helping can do in the community or to help the Black community.
Well, personally, I think these discussions are very important. I think these discussions also need to happen in schools, whether it's a partnership. I'm an educator, so I would say a partnership with not only the private schools, but definitely the public school system. That I think what's important is we continue to hear the stories. There are African Americans that lived during that time that are still around, still living in the area, that I think we need to hear from them. We need to hear their own personal experiences of living in Georgetown, or even coming back to worship in Georgetown at that time. I just believe these dialogues, and I think there also needs to be protection for long-term residents to ensure that Neville and I and the Marshall family and the Burnett family, the Bowman family that are left here can stay here. And it's every year it gets more and more impossible to even, maintain our homes here. And I think it's an issue in Georgetown. I think it's an issue throughout DC and what's happening. You talk about African Americans not getting loans. Well, that continues to be an issue now in terms of for mortgages or businesses. When a house goes on sale and you've worked hard and you bring your deposit, your down payment for that house, the developers are buying out or outpricing the values of homes that middle class people, period, aren't able to purchase. So I would say having partnerships with schools, continuing programs like this, and to have those honest discussions like we're doing, but to continue that with more panelists.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Ann.
I know that when we were speaking earlier, when we were talking about what the program ought to look like, I know one of the things that I had said, this is not unique to Georgetown, and certainly we're seeing it in most urban centers. We're also seeing it in places like the Sea Islands. I mean, if in fact you don't put some priority on the history of the place and to say in order to preserve it, these are the things that have to protect it so that, maybe long-term residents, not the newcomers, but the long-term residents, their tax rates don't go up. I mean, it's what you value. And, I think that very often people come to a neighborhood, like you're saying, in the 20s and the 30s, these folks came and Georgetown looked like a quaint place. Well, it's a quaint place until it's totally flooded. And then it's transformed into something else. I live in Florida now. I come home to Washington, D.C. Sometimes I don't even know what street I'm on. I mean, everything is changed and under the guise of development. And what is development? I think that those are questions that have to be tackled seriously in all of these communities that I think are threatened, because in America it's viewed as progress. What does that mean? Those are hard questions that I think we need to begin to have a discussion about. How do we preserve history and place value on it and the people who live and make a place?
Yeah, and I think, thank you, Monica and Ann. One of the other questions that came in from the group that relates to this had to do with oral histories. And I wonder from you all in the neighborhood or those of you who are affiliated with or have been affiliated with the various universities, are there examples of oral history repositories other documentation that would be resources for those who are attending tonight or others in the community to turn to, or efforts to grow those resources in the community.
No one brought up
Adam,
the fact that there's a video that goes with the book, and I know that it's on PBS, which is the oral history of the residents that were recorded. So that's one important piece of them, a diverse group of residents, and that's what it is, sharing their stories and experiences. But in terms of, I don't know of any events or groups personally. I don't know, Dr. Musgrove or Ann, if you've heard of anything. I know Georgetown had the anniversary of the book a couple years ago, and we brought us together, and the audience was packed with former Georgetown residents who stood up and spoke and shared their experiences. But I think while these people are still living, we have to try to find a way virtually now because of COVID, but to really bring, for something similar to this, to bring them together.
Mm-hmm. I would urge people who are interested in that to also reach out to their public school systems, educators, make this preservation part of curricula, teach students how to gather stories, how to archive stories, how to preserve stories. And if we have many, many schools doing this, we have many, many more stories. There is increasingly funding from places like the NEH, places like the National Archives, not a lot, and heaven knows what will happen in the future, but there are increasingly efforts to try and support programs like that. So I do think it has to be, or I think one of the things that will help that is to make it a grassroots effort and to not make it a special project, for example, that goes with the university's bicentennial, but make it part of every public school curriculum.
Thank you, Dr.
If I could
go
jump
ahead,
in.
Adam. Yeah, and Dr. Rothman, if you might also expand, we had some questions about Georgetown University, and so specifically the role that the university played in the Black community here in Georgetown in terms of the enslaved population, as well as what Georgetown can do or is doing right now in this area.
Great. Yeah, I think one thing I want to say is, and I've learned actually so much from this conversation and hearing the family histories and testimony just tonight. One thing that's really struck me as a teacher teaching students at Georgetown about the history of slavery and what followed is that you don't have to go to Mississippi to grasp this history. That everything we've been talking about today, all of these processes of enslavement, of emancipation, of segregation, displacement, and gentrification, these aren't things, they are things that happened in a lot of places, but they are also things that happened right here in our own backyards. And it actually is an incredible teaching opportunity to work with students to understand that history is all around us. It's part of their world. It's not something that can be tucked away in a textbook or is something to be ruffled through in the stacks of a library. So Dr. Babb's idea of enlisting students, even high school students or college students at a place like Georgetown or American or GW or UMBC, to conduct these oral histories, to train them to conduct these oral histories, would be an amazing thing, actually, and to enlist the expertise of all of the libraries and archives we have in this vicinity to preserve those stories and to make them accessible through things like digitization. These are things we can actually do. And they are actually being done in some places, both at universities and elsewhere. I think of StoryCorps, for instance, in the ways that they're gathering stories of people's lives. I think that's what we need to do here, but quite intentionally to recover the kinds of histories we've been talking about tonight.
And to not think of it as history also, to think of it as something that is just part of ongoing human experience. Yes, this might have happened in the 30s or 40s, but as everyone on the panel has pointed out, similar things are still going on today. So let's not, I'm sorry, Adam, I don't mean to insult the professor.
I don't take it personally.
But let's expand
yeah.
our understanding of what history is, I guess I would say.
I actually always say that history is too important to be left to the historians. So I think you're saying that in a different way.
A friend of mine just shared, thank you to Lee Granados, the Humanities DC Oral History Project at humanitiesdc.org was a suggestion that she sent to me. So thank you for that, Lee.
Thank you. And Washington history guru Jerry McCoy is with us as one of the attendees tonight, and he made mention of the oral history collection at the DC Public Library's Washingtoniana division. So that is also worth checking out as well. And we'll get the resource for that link out to the participants. A question came in. Please go ahead, Derek.
This addresses both your first and your last question. And I think one of the key things to remember when we're talking about trying to figure out how best to memorialize a population is that the best advocates for a particular population are typically its members, right? And so you'll notice that just on this call, you have three of only a small handful of the Black families that are historical residents of and contemporary residents of Georgetown. And I think that one of the things that we have to remember is that this effort to preserve Georgetown's history, whether it's the Mount Zion Cemetery, which needs tremendous help in sort of documenting who is in those graves and where the headstones go, and just with typical maintenance, or the sorting out the files of some of the historical Black churches in the area. But what we have to remember is that the best advocates for creating those collections and maintaining those spaces would be Black Georgetown residents. And so we should think about, not just the history of Black Georgetown, but also expanding the size of the Black Georgetown population. And so this really has a lot to do with contemporary public policy. The mayor put out a report just a year ago where she was talking about not just building additional low-income housing to deal with the city's housing crunch, but to making sure that that housing was properly distributed across the city. It wasn't all packed into the poorer wards. And so Georgetown, if the mayor is held to her plan, should be getting more low-income housing. And in a city where white wealth is 10 times Black wealth, one would expect that a disproportionate number of the people that go into that housing would be African American. If you grow the Georgetown Black population and help it to stay in place for those who are already there, you have a bigger constituency for building these historical collections.
Derek, thank you. And that leads a bit into one of the other questions that came in. There was clearly discussion on the panel today about the challenges that preservation brought and some of the landmarks of houses of African Americans that were lost in the process or in the cause of preservation. Are there sites today in Georgetown that you all would recommend we consider preserving to celebrate the legacy of Black Georgetown? Are there things we should be looking at to preserve this part of the community's history?
The churches, I would definitely say, the churches that financially are struggling because they don't have the membership that they had, and now with COVID, what they had is even less. For those who are even still open, I know my church, Epiphany Catholic Church, has opened their doors again. And I would definitely say the cemetery, the Mount Zion Cemetery. I would say the community house at Mount Zion as well, and then supporting the maintenance of the documents at the churches, the documents our families have, and to be able to preserve that. And wherever they'll be housed. I think one thing is we have to make sure that the Peabody Room at the Georgetown Library has enough resources to to discuss the rich history, or the artifacts need to be in there of the African American community here in Georgetown. So that would be my suggestion. I don't know, Ann and everyone else. And
one of the things that I would really like to see, particularly for Georgetown, so people have a sense. I don't know whether they're in Columbia Heights and different places in DC, they have like this, almost like a poster, Wayside, and it has old pictures and descriptions. I mean, so that if on Herring Road, there could be pictures in a whole little story.
Mm-hmm.
So it's accessible to people, you know, who kind of stumble on it, because a lot of times it's not going to be that people are going to go to an institution or a church, but if it's visible easily as you're walking down the street, and then then you go, oh, Epiphany Church, oh, around the corner, oh, you know, I mean, I think that it has to be a way of hooking people. I mean, you know, it's almost like a marketing thing, but it has to be done. Otherwise, it becomes history, and you know, only for a select few. So I think that it's not a either or. It's all of these suggestions are ands. This is what has to be done.
Thank you. Dr. Rothman, I realize we didn't get to the question that came in earlier, and then we had someone else ask as well about the university and the impact that the Jesuits had on the Black population in Georgetown, and wondered if you want to speak a bit about that and the university's work in that history. On that.
Sure, yeah. One of the things we've learned a lot about over the last 5 years is the university's direct connection to the enslaved and free Black communities in Georgetown. People know a lot about what we call the GU 272, or the enslaved community on the Jesuit plantations in Maryland. But there's also a even more direct connection on campus. So pouring through the ledgers of Georgetown College, going back to the 1790s, we've found the names of dozens of enslaved people who worked on campus, mostly who were not owned by the Jesuits, but were actually hired from from neighbors of Georgetown, who basically rented them out to the university to perform labor. And the wages that were paid were not paid to the workers, they were paid to the owners of the slaves. So we know their names in a lot of cases. We know, for instance, the name of the very last enslaved person who worked at Georgetown was a man named Aaron Edmondson. And we've been trying to figure out if he's connected to the Edmondson family from the Pearl, but haven't been able to make that connection yet. We know as well that many of the Black members of Holy Trinity Church between about 1818 and the late 1830s were actually buried on Georgetown's campus. There's now a building that's been built over that cemetery. It was built in the 1950s. So there are all sorts of connections of labor and family and worship that connected the college to the neighborhood. These are the kinds of things that are really you can only come to light through quite intensive archival research. And that's one of the reasons why it's so important to preserve the archives of Black community institutions in Georgetown. You know, if they're not preserved, Georgetown did a good job preserving its own archives. The Jesuits did a good job preserving their own archives. But these institutions need help preserving their archives, or they're just going to disappear. We hear a lot about, in the controversies over monuments, about erasing history. Well, the best way to really erase history is to destroy archives. Then the history is gone. So I reiterate I echo this call to pay attention to the preservation of archives and to commemorate these places that are in danger of fading from memory.
And I think we also need to think about how to do that digitally.
Yeah, absolutely. The Georgetown Slavery Archive is a good example of a digitization effort that's made a wealth of resources, a wealth of archival materials available for anybody to see. You don't have to make an appointment to go to the Booth Family Center for Special Collections at Georgetown to see the records from the financial ledgers of Georgetown to see who was working on campus. There is a lot of material that's digitized. I think for those of you who are interested in African American family history going back to the era of slavery, a great source, for instance, that has been digitized are the compensation petitions from the DC Emancipation Act. Those petitions are online, and they contain the names of hundreds of enslaved people, first and last names in many cases. And it's a gold mine for genealogists. There's a whole history around why those records exist, we could talk about. But just for family history, there are incredible sources out there, but you have to know where to look for them.
So clearly, each of you could have been a 2-hour webinar conversation just yourself. So we're just scratching the surface tonight. And I know that we had more questions come in that we won't be able to get to specifically. So those of you who have entered comments or questions, please know that we will circulate those to the panelists and try to get back to you all individually afterward. And before we wind down to the panelists, I wonder if you have any final comments or additions that you'd like to add to leave the group with before we turn to our conclusion this evening.
Well, I just want to make one note. It was interesting that the first title I thought about for this work was The Forgotten Georgetown. And then after discussions and conversations, Black Georgetown Remembered just made so much more sense. So I think if we can kind of think of that as a process we can all engage in, going from forgotten to remembered, and what that really deeply entails.
Thank you for that, Dr. Babb. I know I'm leaving this conversation with a lot to think about and a lot of ideas for moving forward. So thank you for that. I will turn the mic, so to speak, over now to yes, our friend Jeffrey Nichols, the director at Georgetown Heritage, to wrap us up. Thank you all.
Thank you, Karen. And you know, sitting here listening to this fascinating conversation, just thinking about the world we live in today, and we hear so much about systemic racism. What we talked about today was systemic racism, that legacy that has been with our country from the very beginning and continues today. And incorporating this important part of our history is critical to tell the full story of American history, warts and all, is the only way for us to move forward as a community. So thank you all for being here tonight. Dr. Babb, Ms. Chin, Dr. Musgrove, Dr. Roche, Dr. Rothman, and a big thank you to Neville Waters as well for so ably guiding the conversation. And I also want to thank all the staff of the partner organizations who worked literally behind the scenes to make all of this happen tonight. So the staff of the Mount Zion Female Union Band Society, Cemetery Foundation, Tudor Place, Dumbarton House, and my own Georgetown Heritage. Thank you all for your efforts. And our hope is that this is the first of a number of conversations that will follow in the months to come. So please keep your eye out on our various websites and social media accounts for hopefully some upcoming conversations that will continue to talk about this important story in Georgetown and in the United States. And you also, as participants in the program, you'll also receive a follow-up email that will have a recording of tonight's conversation, as well as some additional links. I know I've been sharing them along as we've been going, but for some further research, ways that you could possibly take action yourself and get involved in some of the discussion that we had tonight. And I believe on the screen we'll be getting a slide that shows you some of the ways that you will be able to follow up with all of us and stay in touch with these groups. There it is, and how you can find out about more information of our organizations and what's happening next. So again, thank you to all the panelists, all the staff members, and of course all of you in attendance tonight. We really appreciate your interest in this topic and program. So thank you all for being here and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.